Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our meeting this afternoon, our award ceremony meeting. I'm Lisa Lee. I'm the chair of the board of APPE, which puts on this incredible event, the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl. I'm so delighted to be here and really delighted even more to welcome you all here to the 27th APPE Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl. We are in person and we are live streaming. So we are really psyched for having both of our audiences together because we are so thrilled to be back in person. Everyone, I've gotten at least 20 comments this last couple of days about the energy that people feel in this room and in this conference and at this event. So thank you all for being here. I want to congratulate all the teams who came here to compete, who did a fantastic job in their preparation and their regional competitions and made it here to nationals. You should all be very proud of the work that you've done. I would also like to thank the hundreds of volunteers that make this thing happen every year. We'll meet, you've met many of them, the judges, the moderators, but the case writers, the people behind the scenes who really organize, get the chairs in the room, get us to the right rooms and with the right setup. So we couldn't do it without that, as John said, his small army of volunteers, and I just really am grateful for all of you who have stepped up to make this an incredible experience. Before we get to the final match, and all this will be announced shortly by John, I wanted to, we have a few special awards and announcements. So it is, as I said, the 27th annual APPE IEB. But this competition actually started 3 years before that. It started about exactly 30 years ago when it was a brilliant idea by a young professor whose name is Bob Ladenson, who was really, the guiding force behind this entire idea. And since then, since its 30 years, it has grown to an intercollegiate event that has expanded to high schools and middle schools all across the globe. We have teams on nearly every continent. And we continue to develop this programming into even a corporate ethics bowl, which we've been experimenting with to keep the ethics bowl spirit alive across the lifespan. In recognition of this 30 years and the 30 years of this event, we're introducing a new award this year, and that's the APPE IEB Virtue and Service Award. This award is to honor the contributions of the many committed and innovative volunteers who make this event so awesome. This competition is powered by those volunteers who are dedicated to helping students develop critical thinking skills and to become leaders, colleagues, citizens, and friends. This award is just a small token of APPE's appreciation of all of their work to make this happen. This year, we're pleased, we're going to start with 2 of these awards. This will be the special year that we launch with 2. And the first recipient, I am delighted to disclose, is Bob Ladenson. For those of us who think logically, this makes a lot of sense. It's Bob's vision that made APPE IEB the institution that it's become. It's his continued commitment to the Ethics Bowl and the Ethics Bowl Committee, even today, grounds us all in the foundational goals of this program. From the very first time that Pat introduced me to Bob at one of my very first Ethics Bowls a long time ago, all the way through our coffee earlier today, I have found Bob always to be an inspiration to me. And I am 100% certain that I'm not the only one in the room who thinks that and feels this way. The 2 words, thank you, have never had to do so much work as they have to do today. Bob, thank you for everything. All right, And as promised, we have a second APPE IEB Virtue and Service Award this year. And this award goes to Joanne Ladenson. Joanne's involvement in the success of IEB is as nearly as old as the program itself. She has served as a quiet and productive and steady participant in helping move IEB from its infancy to what it is today, 30 years later. Her service as a judge or moderator and the willingness to do whatever needed to be done, which continues to this day. And her commitment to the mission of IEB is truly unmatched. Joanne, my friend, will you please accept this award? Well, I truly get the second best job of this day, which is to open this ceremony and provide my friends with these lovely awards. I'm going to turn things over to the man who gets the best part of the day, John Garcia. John is, as all of you know, the fearless and powerful IEB Council Chair who has gotten us through many things over the last several years as we've adapted and done everything we can to ensure that Ethics Bowl is an excellent experience for all of you. John, we want to offer you a round of applause and invite you to the podium.
Oh, great.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for first of all, the note that I dropped my book. And second, the applause. I'll just say a quick word and then we've got some awards to get to. And the quick word is that it is the best job of the weekend, except for it also contains the risk for being the worst job of the weekend at any given moment, such as when I almost sent the questions for the final into one of the semifinals today. So we're reminded that we're always one moment away from some issues. So it really does take an army of volunteers to make everything work. So just thank you again to everybody who's helped behind the scenes and the judges and moderators. I'm going to present a few awards before we get going, and we're going to award the quarterfinalists and the semifinalists here in a moment. Before I do that, I want to present two special awards, the Pat Croskery Memorial Award and the Bob Ladenson Spirit of the Ethics Bowl Award. And I'm going to begin with the Pat Croskery Award. And in a moment, I'm going to have Colin Anthony Chen come up and help me with this. Colin Anthony Chen was last year's recipient of the award and wasn't able to receive it in person, so he will be able to hand it off in person. So the Pat Croskery Memorial Award is given to an Ethics Bowl coach or sponsor who embodies the teachings of Pat Croskery and his commitment to teaching ethics as a means of solving problems both small and large through ethical reasoning, respecting others' differing viewpoints, and creating an environment of open dialogue for his students. The winner of the I'm a very emotional guy. The winner of the 2023 Pat Croskery Memorial Award is Michael Jordan of San Jose. I botched this. I was supposed to read this part before he got the award, but now I'm going to make him stand there. Michael, it's going to be so awkward. Michael has been a longtime coach and mentor to countless students and gives up his time as a volunteer at the regional and national levels of the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl organization. He was nominated by alumni spanning all the way back to 2004, as well as to recent team members. Here are a few highlights from the letters nominating him. Say his students, he was not just a coach, but also a mentor. He helped me to gain respect for competing viewpoints, develop lifelong moral reasoning skills, and learn how to discuss complicated moral issues with those who hold different views in a way that serves to better society. Congratulations again to Michael Jordan as the winner of the 4th annual Pat Crossbury Award.
Thank you.
The second award is the Bob Ladenson Spirit of the Ethics Bowl. It's an award we've always been very excited about. It's awarded to the team recognized by their fellow competitors as best embodying the qualities of civility and courtesy, while also showing an appreciation for the ideas involved in the cases under discussion, in striving to ensure a high quality of discussion of those ideas. This year's recipient of the Bob Ladenson Spirit of the Ethics Bowl is Utah State University. I'm always at my most nervous when I'm reading from a script, and now I don't need the script anymore. So now we'll be awarding the trophies for the quarterfinalists and the semifinalists. And as you know, there was a lot of parity this year's competition. It was really excellent. All the feedback I heard on the teams was outstanding. So it's a big congratulations to all of our quarterfinalists and competitors in the elimination rounds. So now the quarterfinalists. First, Virginia Military Institute. Fair enough. Okay, our next quarterfinalists, and when I call your team name, you can come up as a whole team or send a representative up. University of Chicago. Fair enough. Rollins College. The side effect is the longer you compete, the more you need to go out to eat. So that's why we might be missing some people. The other quarterfinalist, Utah Valley University.
We want to get.
And now our semifinalist teams. Congratulations to Santa Clara University. I'm downloading a coin flip app for the final. Oh, I'm going to need a coin. It's asking me for my Apple ID password. University of Maryland, our other semifinalists. Oh, yeah, thank you. For sure. Oh, wow, okay. That's it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, please welcome our finalists. Tufts University and U.S. Naval Academy. Tufts will be over there and U.S. Naval Academy over here. And judges for the final round, you can come on up as well.
Yeah, this is really yeah, I know, amazing.
Yes.
Chumps.
Kind of agree, yeah. But let's not speculate, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Do we have a template like just a map? Sure.
All right, we're about ready to get started. In a second, I'm going to have the teams introduce themselves. During the match, if you are talking quietly to the person next to you, it sounds quiet. But when 200 of you are doing that, it sounds less quiet. So really try to be careful about murmuring as the match goes on so that the teams can focus. Thank you. Good job. All right, we're going to start with introductions. I'm going to have the Tufts University team introduce themselves, and then the United States Naval Academy, and then finally the judges.
Start here.
Yeah, who's going first?
Hi there, my name is Anna O'Sullivan. I'm a sophomore studying political science and philosophy, and I use she, her pronouns, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I'm Alana. I'm a sophomore studying international relations, and I use the she series pronouns.
My name is David. I'm a junior at Tufts studying math and philosophy with a minor in education. I use he and pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ezra Kanrick. I'm a sophomore studying environmental studies and philosophy, and I use the he series pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Washington Ross. I'm a junior at the Naval Academy. I'm a math with economics major, Chinese minor with a focus on chemistry.
Howdy, y'all. My name is Eddie Ramirez. I'm a junior at the Naval Academy, and I'm astrophysics major. I use he, him pronouns.
Hi, my name is Kyle Beasley. I'm a senior at the Naval Academy studying quantitative economics, he, him.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackson Hathaway. I'm a senior political science major at the Naval Academy, and I use he, him.
Hi, I'm Olivia Hunt. I'm a junior at the Naval Academy. I'm a quantitative economics major.
Hi, my name is Ryan Knight. I'm a history major, and I'm a freshman.
Hello, I'm Deborah Maurer. I'm the director of the Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Mississippi, and I'm also a member of the board of directors for the Association of Practical and Professional Ethics.
I'm Daniel Wiese. I'm professor of philosophy at Tufts University.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alex Richardson. I'm the director of the National High School Ethics Bowl and also a member of the APPE board of directors. Thrilled to be here with you.
Okay, you've already met me. All right, now let's have you call it in the air. Yes.
Yeah, I just realized that.
It is heads. Tufts University, would you like to go first or second?
We're gonna go second.
Second, okay. Judges, please note that the United States Naval. Please note that the United States Naval Academy is team number 1 and Tufts University is team number 2. I'm going to announce the case in question, then pass it out, and then when I get back to the podium, I'll start the timer. First case of the finals, case number 9, this bud's not for you. The question, when, if ever, is it unacceptable for a government to impose religious laws on persons who are not of the state religion or who are visitors from other countries? You need me to repeat it? I'm going to repeat it. When, if ever, is it unacceptable for a government to impose religious laws on persons who are not of the state religion or who are visitors from other countries? You have 2 minutes starting now. 15 seconds.
Verbal, visual approach. Verbal warning at 3 and 1. Verbal warning would be great. Thank you so much. No problem.
All right. U.S. Naval Academy, we're ready for your presentation. You have 10 minutes, and I will give you a verbal warning at 3 minutes and 1 minute remaining. You may begin.
First of all, we'd like to thank everyone involved, especially Tufts University, our judges, our moderator, and the APPE staff for providing us this excellent opportunity to be here tonight and discuss a very pressing societal issue for not only specific countries, but human society as a whole. And the question of when, if ever, it is unacceptable for a government to impose religious laws on persons who are not of the state religion or who are visitors from other countries. And to answer that question, we are going to say that there are conditions where it is unacceptable, and we're going to dive into some of those conditions, and I'll pass it to my teammates to elaborate. But just to keep it at a basic level, one of the main conditions we're going to cite is direct harm to persons, especially when they are not of that religion and they are not engaging in that dialogue. And one of the frameworks we're going to cite and kind of adapt to our case is the social contract framework, not only in the sense of a government, but also in the sense of an organized religion and the people's participation within that religion. And to talk about some of the competing interests and stakeholders in this case, I'll pass it to Olivia.
To go on some of the internal tensions and relationships within this case, the first one I'd like to get into is obviously the people and the state. The people live under the state, they are held to the state's laws, and the state has an obligation to protect its people. Another internal tension would be between the religion and the people. Obviously, the people are held to the regulations of the religion, especially if it's a theocracy where the religion and the state are one. And obviously, the people look to the religion for their personal flourishing in some cases. We'd also like to say the state and the religion, whether the intentions and goals and things that the state is trying to get done are in line with the religion or if they are not. And then obviously minorities within the religion or minorities within the state, people who are persecuted by these religions, we think are important to consider in whatever framework, as well as the non-nationals who are visiting this state, visiting this possible theocracy, their personal freedoms, and as well that they had not necessarily signed that social contract.
And just to elaborate on the position that Jackson already said, we're really focusing on 3 groups of people. One is visitors. One is people who do not subscribe to the state religion, but have the ability to leave or the government assists their ability to leave that state. And 3 is people that do not subscribe to the state religion, but are unable to leave that state for whatever reason. And for visitors, we think that in the post-Westphalian system of states, states have sovereignty. And so there's the idea that a state can actually refuse any visitors if it wants. And if they are accepting visitors, they should simply make sure that those visitors have informed consent as to the conditions of their visiting. But the state is not obligated to allow visitors necessarily for any reason. Additionally, there is the people that do not subscribe to the religion, but have the ability to leave, and the state will assist their leaving. We think that this is a case where the state can still demand that their religion is upheld in that state as long as they're willing to help the people relocate who do not subscribe to that state religion. And in the third case, where you are not able to leave but you do not subscribe to the state religion, is what Jackson said. You have to allow a stable social contract where there is not going to be direct harm to the people that are in the minority of people that do not subscribe to the state religion. So I'll pass it on for some further considerations.
Thank you, Kyle. I'd like to bring up a potential alternative consideration that one might make when talking about states that have laws that might not necessarily cause harm, but might deprive a person visiting that state of their autonomy. We'd like to maintain that a person who makes the decision to visit a country does so under the understanding that when they are in the country in question, they will follow the laws and regulations that are imposed in this country. So in particular, a person who is making the autonomous decision to visit a country does so understanding that if a country has laws that might violate their autonomy, that they are agreeing to do so because they are, in a sense, visiting.
I want to expand on a couple of considerations here, especially with the point Eddie just brought up about the visitors. We want to explain that this must be an informed exchange of information, and there must be an informed consent on the terms of the visitors. And we believe that this informed consent really dives into some of the issues with the specific case of Qatar and the World Cup, where Qatar deceived the international community and deceived Budweiser in making this contract, while then intending to change their mind once Budweiser had already sunk millions of dollars into the investment into the World Cup. And we believe this deception can still be applied to individuals, especially even more importantly, in the terms of direct harm, personal safety, and personal autonomy. The countries must advertise the real world consequences of not following their laws, and they cannot, once the visitors are in the country, suddenly change their mind and apply ex post facto laws that can then discriminate against certain groups. And then secondly, I want to address a potential alternative viewpoint and a concern that may be very pressing in today's society. Well, what about the Uyghurs in China? Would you consider that a state-sponsored relocation program? No, we believe that the state-sponsored relocation, the state-sponsored accommodation, it should be that. It should be accommodation. It should not be persecution. It definitely should not be ethnic cleansing or genocide. But we must, if a state is going to enforce these laws and enforce a state religion, they need to provide these accommodations and provide this opportunity. It should be in a positive, proactive sense, and most definitely not in a negative, reactive sense.
As we're talking about the social contract, one thing that we wanted to talk about was at what threshold of buy-in from the people should we then be employing these restrictions? And we would want to say that it shouldn't be just the slim majority of where it's 51% of the population agrees to it, but the other 49 is then limited as a consequence. It instead should follow the general will. And while that's hard to measure, it should be a more overwhelming majority where people are okay with it or they subscribe to those ideas, where hopefully we would want it to be more of a bottom up, where the government is representing what the people below, the general populace, believe should be enacted in government.
And so really just to hit on some of the nuances of our application of social contract theory, because you absolutely agree that especially when you're dealing with different cultures, different religions, different systems of government, that there is really no one size fits all application of this theory, especially when you're talking about the inherent relationship between the government and its people, which varies very differently between states. And that is why we believe that in the delineation between the different groups of people, the voluntary visitors, the voluntary residents, the members of the organized state religion, as well as the religious and even cultural minorities, is important for the nuanced application of this theory, and why the importance of accommodations and the offering of a way out, really, or a way to conform without having to change fundamental religious values is so important to our application of this theory.
Additionally, one additional perspective is, what does this mean for individual corporations? Is this the same idea of a corporation imposing some sort of religious-based imposition? Do we have the same standard that we're putting forward for states to impose some sort of religious laws? And we would say this is fundamentally not the same. We have a framework of corporate contractarianism that we can use for those specific cases, and that is not the same as the social contract, which applies to the state.
And really to tie that back into one of our main concerns is the direct harm. When a state is imposing direct harm on people who are not of the state religion or visitors of the other countries, and my mind immediately goes to anti-LGBT laws in many Middle Eastern countries where people who are of the LGBT community face incredible risk by traveling to these countries because they impose very strict anti-LGBT laws that often involve direct harm and even the threat of death to everyone. It's not just members of the state religion, it's not just citizens of that country, but it is everyone. And while we aren't going to say that each country has to police and advocate as if the entire world is going to flow through their gates, there must be one, that informed consent and informed exchange of information, and two, the methods of accommodation in order to prevent that direct harm and accommodate for that direct harm not being imposed on people who do not conform to the state religion.
We would also want to ensure that in this flow of information, there is the ability for dissent. There's the ability for activism. We see in certain nations such as China, there is not that ability to dissent. It is cramped down upon. So therefore, the government is not able to act in the interest of the general will of the populace because they don't have that information.
And with that, just to recap, we are in answering the question of when, if ever, it is unacceptable for a government to impose religious laws on persons who are not of the state religion or who are visitors, we are saying that there are several situations where it is indeed unacceptable. And we wanted to lay a couple ground rules to where if a government is going to impose such a type of laws, even on people who are non-citizens, there must be these ground rules such as the prevention of direct harm, the accommodation for free movement, and the accommodation to opt in and out of the system as they please, as well as the adherence to and acknowledgement of the social contract and how that may apply even to citizens who may fall under religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And with that, we would once again like to thank the team from Tufts, the judges, the moderators, and the APPE staff for giving us this incredible opportunity to rematch our regional playoffs, and we see the rest of our time.
Thank you. Okay, Tufts University, you have 1 minute to confer. I'll warn you in about 15 seconds and then 5 minutes for presentation. Would you like verbal or visual or both? Verbal? Okay. 1 minute starting now. Fifteen seconds. Okay, that's time. And I'll give you a verbal warning at 3 and 1 minute. Your 5 minutes commentary starts now.
Okay, thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank the United States Naval Academy for their thoughtful commentary and for the opportunity to come together for this match again. So we loved your framework. We thought it was really thoughtful, but we're just going to offer, some of our commentary to help expand on it. So you talk about, you say there are conditions where it is unacceptable for them to, pose their restrictions onto travelers, and you cite direct harm to persons as the reason for these restrictions. I guess what I'm wondering is just how do you measure this? You talk a little bit about a standard of autonomy, and I really appreciated the example you brought up because, specifically with this case with the Qatar game, LGBTQ plus individuals were a huge part of the controversy surrounding Qatar and religious freedom. But one thing that I felt like maybe I would love to hear you expand on further is the difference between, a person in the LGBTQ plus community being able to go to Qatar and, not fear persecution simply for their identity, and the ability to dress, maybe wear a pride pin, maybe bring a rainbow flag. So where do you draw the line, first of all, between identity and expression? Is there a difference in your framework between the two? And then also, I would love to push you on I think a counter argument that could be posed to your claim is that when you talk about direct harms, how would you respond to the claim that any violation of the state religion is a harm to its people if they have these deeply held beliefs about their religion, about, what they need to do to protect the sanctity of their religion? How would you respond to sort of a commentary that that could be a direct harm in and of itself? And yeah, with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, David.
Thank you so much, guys, for your presentation. Something I wanted to touch on was you guys spoke a lot about cases in which these sorts of practices of imposition of religious laws are unacceptable. But I think hanging over all of this is the question of why they're acceptable at all. I think that implicit in your argument of that there are certain cases where it is acceptable is an argument that theocracy itself is ethically justified, which we don't find to be intuitive. So I think we'd like to hear a little more about why theocracy itself is ethically justified. Why is this practice ever justified? You guys appeal to certain American freedoms that we find ethically compelling. You talk about the necessity of democracy, that people need to be democratically deciding to impose these laws, and also that there needs to be a freedom of speech speech element that people need to be able to dissent. So why, I guess I'm curious, why doesn't the freedom of religion then flow from this, which would then sort of imply that all theocracy is not ethically justified and therefore make it unacceptable in all cases. So I guess I'd like to hear about how you guys approach that. I'd also like to just bring up a case of, you guys talked about visitors coming with informed consent. I just like to note the example of refugees. There are a lot of people who come to countries without any informed consent, without any knowledge, without any desire to come to these countries, but are essentially compelled to out of circumstance. Now, you guys talk a bit about how states have an obligation to help these people be relocated, but I think the question still remains, while they are in that country, is it ethically permissible for this state to impose religious laws on these people who have already been victimized, who have already been expelled from their own country for one reason or another? Should they be subject to these laws as well? So those are the two main points that I was hoping to press on, and then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Alana.
I apologize. You have 1 minute, 30 seconds left.
Okay, thank you. So I only have two questions to pose. The first question was, when doing research, we realized one of these religious laws was essentially visitors were warned that if they could not present a marriage certificate, that they may not receive prenatal health care. And so my question is even if these people consent to it, is it still ethically permissible to just deny them health care if they were there in the country and for some reason it had some emergency involving the baby? The second question I have is, what if laws were to change while people were visiting these countries?
Also, to revisit the point of theocracies in general, you talk about how countries, and we recognize the sovereign, the morally sentient issues of sovereignty of nations. We wonder, how far will you take this ability for countries to determine who can and cannot enter their own nation? Would you guys be promoting of some kind of discriminatory ban that is explicitly not allowing people from a certain religion or race to enter a country just because people within that country consent to banning them from entering? And I think with that,
And then just one last thing with the remaining time. I thought it was really great that you touched on the ability to dissent within a country. I was just hoping that we could expand on that a little bit more with the time that you guys have to respond. I think that was a really important point that I would love to hear. Just expanded upon how that works within your framework. But I think with that, we're all set and we're really excited to hear your response.
Okay, and that's time. Thank you. I missed the 3 minute with them, so in the interest of fairness, I'm going to give you a 2 minute warning and a 1 minute warning in the response to the commentary. You have 1 minute to confer starting now. Fifteen seconds. Okay, that's time. And you have 5 minutes to respond to that commentary. And as a reminder, I'm going to give you warnings at 2 minutes remaining and 1 minute remaining. You may begin.
Thank you. And we would like to start off by thanking Tufts for their wonderful addition to this discussion. And just to get right into the meat and bones of it, to talk about one of your questions about, especially with regards to the justification of theocracy overall and perhaps different judgments about different governing systems around the world, we believe that this is where, while we will tie in social contract theory, and I will also defer to my teammate Kyle, this is also where some of the pragmatic concerns, especially if you deal with certain laws being applied differently across the world. We're not trying to police the world, and we also understand that we do not want to police the world and impose a certain standard, a certain cultural-based standard, or perhaps an American-centric standard on the entire world. And that's where we really wanted to cite in our main presentation the nuance of our social contract application and how we do understand that the contract between the governed and the governing may look differently across different cultures.
I'd like to quickly address the great point you brought up about refugees with the many crises that are currently going on. Specifically, we would say we draw the line of no direct harm in any case with these states. So refugees will be protected by this no direct harm. And we see that these refugees crises are really an issue of humanitarian concern globally. And so I think the international community, not just that state, should be responsible for helping relocate those individuals to somewhere that honors their dignity and allows them to move forward.
In order to answer your question about theocracy and is it acceptable at all, is theocracy in itself ethically justified? We would say here in the US, we've separated church and state. Some places that is not in their theory. We have a multicultural framework over a nationalist framework that respects non-Western theory. We're here to say that it's not the will, we're not here to say whether or not a God exists. We're only here to allow for an ethical theory to exist, to represent and advocate for the people who believe there is one, and that his power and his will is inseparable from that of the states.
And just to quickly address one of your concerns about the violation of the state religion being a potential harm to the citizens, we believe that actually is really helpful for reinforcing why we draw this nuance in the social contract, as well as why we draw the nuance between the citizens, the visitors, and the citizens who may be not of the state religion. And we believe that's why the governments many of these governments take on this duty to protect the sanctity of their state religion because of the perceived harms that people may take. And this is especially present when dealing with Qatar's norms on alcohol and how that affected their decision-making with regards to the World Cup.
And we want to address that social contract or forms of it can be seen in other cultures. For example, in the implied consent with the mandate of heaven, or it is the will of the way in China, or in how certain sects of Islam decide on who their leaders will be.
Furthermore, I wanted to bring up the point of informed consent. So you asked a question about neonatal laws in these Middle Eastern countries and whether or not a person who visits these countries should be allowed to get neonatal laws or not be allowed under our framework. Well, again, we maintain that if there is an informed consent when they choose to visit these countries of the requirements that they would need to go to these countries and be provided healthcare, if there is an informed consent and they know this before they go and then they choose to go anyway,
2 minutes.
It's okay for these countries to impose these laws on them in our framework. But of course, if there is a direct harm to the pregnant woman, that is, if she is going to die, if she does not get harm, and then it is unacceptable for these countries to impose a law that would not allow her to get health care. Furthermore, I wanted to bring up your question about whether or not, where we draw the line between the LGBTQ, harm for LGBTQ communities in terms of self-expression versus self-identity, and where we draw the line between identity and self-expression. And I want to expand that question more broadly to women in general in Middle Eastern countries. Again, along this vein of informed consent, many Middle Eastern countries require women to cover their faces, to cover their hair, et cetera, and Western women visiting these Middle Eastern countries go to these Middle Eastern countries with the informed consent and the informed knowledge that in order to best respect the culture of these countries, they have to adhere to these cultural values. So we say that there's no direct harm in not
1 minute
allowing an LGBTQ person to display a pride pin if they choose to visit these countries under informed consent. But of course, if they are going to be murdered for their sexuality, then it is unacceptable.
But additionally, the only parties in the ethical dilemma posed there is not just the government and the people that are there. It's also the FIFA World Cup who decided to host that event in that country, knowing that it would affect people in that way. And so we see another ethical consideration from that viewpoint.
And just to address one last question, your question about what about the laws changing during the duration of someone's stay? And just to highlight, apart from our main presentation, the idea of ex post facto enforcement and the enforcement of new laws on old misconduct, we do not endorse. And we believe that violates the principle of informed consent. And just overall, we'd like to thank you once again for your contribution to this discussion. And with that, we will cede the rest of our time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Judges, you now have 1 minute to confer about questions you might want to ask, and then let me know, and we'll start the Q&A. About 10 more seconds. Ready? Okay, we'll have a 10-minute question and answer session with the United States Naval Academy. I'm going to go at 5, 3, and 1 minute warnings during this time frame.
Sounds good.
Okay, begin.
All right, I'm going to start with a deceptively simple, maybe even yes/no question, and then I have a follow-up that is less simple. So is not being able to drink at a soccer game consist in a direct harm? Just real quick.
I think we'd say no.
Okay, so what's the conception of harm here, right? Is it counterfactual? Is it like a sort of threshold thing where like beyond a certain point, like that constitutes a direct harm? Does it have to do with welfare? Does it have to do with dignity? Tell me a little about the normative architecture of the concept.
I think we want to talk about, especially the welfare, and especially with direct harm, with a lot of our examples, we want to talk about like the human health and well-being of the individual. So unless you physically require alcohol to survive, which I'm sure some people may assert, it's not a direct harm for them to be withheld from imbibing at a World Cup game. And however, especially with the brilliant example that was brought up with prenatal health care, that is especially where there's the potential for that direct harm and that direct impact on the health and well-being of the individual. And that's where we want to base our framework for that on.
And we wanted to account for that, it's not just something where you're basing physical harm. That's why we say well-being. It also accounts into psychological, and that's where the respect also ties into it. That idea of, you being confined would also tie into your psychological health.
And I think with the psychological, that's where a lot of the nuance comes in, because we understand that is a very hard to define and very hard to very nuanced system, because psychological harm can be different for every person. However, that's when we really weigh the nuance of the country, especially with the nuance of the potential harms involved, because at the end of the day, a psychological harm is less of an important factor than death.
So really interesting argument here in thinking about what the limitations ought to be. And a lot of the argument came down to the concept of informed consent. So at one point you made the argument that if visitors to the state know about what the laws are ahead of time and they do indeed consent and then they come and then the laws change, that there can't retroactively be a law which punishes them. But I wonder if maybe the principle of informed consent is not the right principle to appeal to here. Perhaps consistency is a principle that might work better in this case. So first answer that and then I have a follow-up.
So we actually see these tying two together. So we believe that when a person is going to visit a country, that they have an understanding of that culture and therefore what laws they would make in line with that culture. So they would have a general understanding of what laws they have and what laws they could have. So that's where the consistency comes in play.
And we recognize how consistency is a vital part of our argument and is a concept that must be included in our argument, but we see it as a subset of ethical informed consent. Consistency must be there, but if you're not informed and the state is consistent, you're not informed, you're going to get killed, and then you're killed consistently. That doesn't really help you, right? So we think that we're identifying it as a subset of proper ethical informed consent.
And really just to hammer this point home, we don't believe the two are mutually exclusive, and we believe that consistency really does have a very important role to play in informed consent. And just to kind of expand on Kyle's point, if we really extrapolate this to the world at whole and political society at large, if there is no consistency in states' governance, then there cannot be an informed decision about what the conditions may look like and what the conditions one might face when visiting a country, because there is no consistency. And we believe, like Kyle said, consistency really can be a form of bedrock that must be present in order for the true informed consent to be there.
So just a quick follow-up question then, given that this is a theocracy where laws can change, how is it possible for any individual to ever have conditions of informed consent?
That's definitely a pertinent question. And we think that the current international standard for visa law and tourism law helps us with this, because each state has a specific guidelines for which passports can be there for which periods of time. So the United States can visit Qatar, I don't know what it is, 45 days without a visa, or maybe they do need a visa. But in any case, the state needs to publish the change in the standard, at least the minimum, the amount of time that everybody can reasonably inform, which should exceed the visa term limits for the common tourist.
Furthermore, I want to bring up the point about the fact that it is a theocracy. Theocracies are based on religions, and religions fundamentally are consistent. For example, every major religion has a sort of bedrock argument for what
5 minutes.
values it espouses. So if you're talking about Christianity, there's the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments don't change. And so with this in mind, we would say that even though laws can change in a theocracy, laws can change in a non-theocracy, but the thing about theocracies is that they're based on something that is fundamentally historically based in certain aspects.
And we would just want there to be consistency on how that government interprets the literature of that religion too.
And I think that that interpretation really digs into one of the other important parts of the fact, because I think we could all agree that, yes, while the 10 Commandments themselves might not change, the application of legal theory, religious theory, governmental theory is really what changes over time. And that's really where the fluidity comes. And that's where Kyle, like Kyle said, we're really putting some onus on the governments themselves to be responsible and to advertise these conditions, especially through visa laws and information that they publish out to the international community. And especially, for example, when you're buying plane tickets or applying for a visa, because the governments themselves, especially as the ones who are the arbiters of this and the ones who will be applying the laws, they are the ones that, especially when we're dealing with non-citizens who are not part of the state religion, have to provide that information so that that informed consent decision can be made. This is not simply just the duty of the visitor, simply just the duty of the tourists, because the tourists themselves often do not have the power to find all the information, especially when the government, who is by definition the highest legal arbiter of the state, has the most information and has the highest ability to disseminate that.
Just over 3 minutes left.
Thank you. The question is about religious laws, and I'm curious about the importance of the religious character of the laws in your argument, as opposed to, say, the positive law of any sovereign nation.
Could you restate that?
Yeah, I'm curious about the significance of the religious character of the laws. That's what the question is about, religious laws, right?
We're going to confer real quick.
So generally, we would say that every government that imposes some sort of form of justice makes assumptions about values, what is valuable, what's the value of human life, and such things. And that the difference between when the law comes from a religious or a secular framework is just where and how you're defining those values.
And that could also be an important application of the social contract here in the agreement between the governing and the governed about where these laws are sourced from, and as well where the government's application falls within like you said, the religious character of the law. And that's where we wanted to really provide a lot of nuance and offer a multicultural perspective that may account for the difference in cultures and religious interpretations across different states.
It seems to me, and of course I could be wrong, that a theocracy doesn't have as a groundwork idea a social contract, because the rules are coming from a divine source, right? It doesn't matter whether people agree with them. It comes from God, and it's going to be right. But the question I really want to ask is, why choose the social contract theory as opposed to, say, human rights, right?
Well, I think that in our framework, which is trying to incorporate many different places where values come from, including Western and Eastern schools of thought, we would say that human rights doesn't speak exactly to the way that the relationship between the government and the governed in the case of certain countries in the world today, including Qatar, in which case we would not be able to apply our framework universally, because a lot of those ratified human rights are not exactly shared by countries from these regions.
I just want to talk about the implication of social contract in theocracy. While I completely agree with you, in many theocracies, the divine is really the source of the law, the government is still the arbiter and the applier, and there still is that agreement for application between the governing and the governed. While there may not be an agreement between the governing and governed about what the law itself is or what the specific values are, because those are reserved religious rights, the application of the law and who is meting out the punishment, who is setting the standards, is what is the contract between the governing and the governed. Because at the fundamental level, the government still has to do something, and they still have to be the arbiters of that religious law.
And that social contract, there's still buy-in that's coming in from people believing in that religion.
And that's time. Okay, take a big, deep breath. We'll be ready for the second half of the match. All right, you were very good audience members for the first half. We're now ready for the second half of the final match of the weekend. And the case is case 12, I Am Vengeance. Again, I'm going to read the question twice, distribute it. Then when I get back to the podium, I'll start the timer. So the question is it ethically justifiable for a state government to use the model of a law they believe is unjust as a model for a law in their own state, with the goal of forcing the Supreme Court to reckon with the original law? A little confusing. I'm going to read it again, or long, not confusing. Beautifully written. Is it ethically justifiable for a state government to use the model of a law they believe is unjust as a model for a law in their own state, with the goal of forcing the Supreme Court to reckon with the original law? Distribute it. Okay, you have 2 minutes starting now. Fifteen seconds. Okay, that's 2 minutes. You'll now have 10 minutes to provide an answer to the moderator's question and I'll give you a verbal warning at 3 minutes and 1 minute remaining. You may begin.
Thank you so much to the U.S. Naval Academy for being here. Thank you to the judges for being here. Thank you for moderating. And thank you to our audience for being here. It's great to have such an audience for this round. So to answer the question, is it ethically justifiable for a state government to use the model of a law they believe is unjust as a model for a law in their own state with the goal of forcing the Supreme Court to reckon with the original law? We say no. And this is based on our idea that states have a vested interest in advocacy, but that it's not justified to treat people as a means to an end. I'll pass it over to David to lay out our framework, and then we'll head into some more specific points.
So to begin, we begin from the ethical principle of, we begin from the concept of recognizing the ethical importance of democracy. Obviously, we have an intuition in this country of the value of consent, or of government by the consent of the governed, but we want to recognize that we're not purely operating on, say, any constitutional or legal standard of democracy. What we're saying is that there's an ethical imperative for society to be run in a way that is broadly acceptable to the people. And so beginning from this concept of democracy, we believe that states have a vested or states have an obligation to create just laws that will fulfill their obligation that they have to their residents. And so to create a law that they believe is unjust simply for this purpose of it reaching the Supreme Court and being overturned, that is violating the will of the people and again, using these people as a means to an end to achieve some sort of Supreme Court overturning, rather than treating them as the ends that they are, rather than respecting their democratic will. So fundamentally, we're relying on states' obligation to their people to create laws that are the best for those people. And so that creating a law that they know is just violates that principle, violates the principle of democracy, that the people of that state should rule that state and make the laws that they believe are the most just. We also recognize that in this particular case and in general, for a state to create a just law with the purpose of getting the Supreme Court to overturn a law based on a law in another state, that is an act of the state trying to change the law of another state. And we believe that this also violates the principle of democracy. For a state to essentially try to impose its own view of the world on the people of another state by using this sort of almost gamesmanship of the court system, trying to sort of get the federal court to overturn the will of the people in that state. So again, we're fundamentally relying on both the obligation of the state to its citizens and to democratic governments to allowing the people in that state to create the laws that they believe are the most just in that state, and also the obligation of states not to interfere in the democratic operations and the democratic system of neighboring states in the country.
Now, I want to discuss sort of a huge sort of difference in our framework, and that's in the case of a major human rights violation. That's in the case we're talking about, like slavery. We're talking about, yeah, I'm just going to settle on the example of slavery. I think that's the right example to settle on. In the case of an example of slavery, it's morally unjustifiable for a state to enforce laws that are just ethically unforgivable. And in that case, we do create an exception in our framework. So it's not okay for a state to, just engage in their own type of advocacy just for the sake of doing it, just for the sake of changing to a law that it, would be better for their economy, would be better for their needs. But they have a vested interest in protecting citizens, not only in their state, but just they cannot pursue an immoral law. That's not all right. So that's where our framework sort of takes a step back. But I just want to address a counter argument, which is that, states have a moral obligation to give their citizens the best laws. They have a moral obligation to give their citizens, the best treatment that they possibly can. They almost have an interest, even in this example of, an economic interest. They have to, provide for their citizens, do what's best for the citizens of their state. I want to loop back to a point that David just made about, this isn't a state just trying to change their own laws. This is a state sort of trying to create law throughout the nation. And that's where we sort of run into an issue, because while states absolutely have an obligation to, create the best possible circumstance for their citizens, they cannot do so at the expense of another state's autonomy to do the same. And now I'll pass it off back to David.
Yeah, I'd just like to address a counter argument, which someone could begin from the principle of democracy and say that states, in fact, do have the right to engage in this sort of gamesmanship of the courts, given that under democracy, if the people collectively decide that they want to pursue this route to the Supreme Court, that should be acceptable. And we reject that, again, on the grounds primarily of what we said earlier, sort of about the need for states to respect the democracies of other states, again, setting aside the sort of carve out that we have in cases of egregious human rights violations. So we just wanted to clarify that this democracy should be respected, but there is this limitation of interfering with other states. There's also the limitation of sort of a fundamental problem that democracies often face, which is protection of minorities, and that pure majoritarian rule can begin to harm minority groups that may not be able to exercise a voice in their government. So if a state were to create a law that they believe to be unjust, that violates or that harms minorities, that wouldn't be able to sort of defeat the majoritarian decision. That's another reason why we need why purely relying on some sort of majoritarian democratic notion is not sufficient in this case to avoid the sort of harms that would come about from the application of an unjust law for the purpose of this legal gamesmanship.
Also, we just want to quickly distinguish between the legal value of the Supreme Court and the democratic value of the Supreme Court and the sort of federal sources of legislation. So, we do understand that especially the Supreme Court is a legal body and it is not, inherently democratic. We do recognize it as an arbiter of our law and of our democracy. We don't recognize necessarily that this is the most ideal way to decide how to implement a law. We could, in theory, have everyone vote on everything. But at the same time, we do want to recognize their ethical value in keeping a check on our laws throughout the nation.
I'd also like to, as long as we're on the topic of the Supreme Court, note that in the case where this is warranted, in the case where,
3 minutes,
where a state takes a similarly unjust law and modifies it such that it would then be struck down by the Supreme Court, the natural course that a state would take would be to simply challenge that law in that state and let that go to the Supreme Court. And so the need for this legal gamesmanship in this case is suggestive of a deep issue in the court. In this case, what we're looking at, as discussed in the particular instance in this case of California creating the gun law to challenge the Texas abortion law, that's the California liberal state recognizing the significant conservative bias on the Supreme Court and seeking to get around that by creating instead a liberal law that will be struck down because they know that the conservative abortion law will not be struck down. And the fact that we're in a state in the United States where we're engaging in this political gamesmanship and the courts, which are supposed to be the impartial arbiters of the law, is in and of itself signs of a deeply pernicious issue in the legal system, and that this sort of practice of states doing this gamesmanship even further is only going to further entrench the politicization of the courts and the sort of growing awareness and belief in this country that the courts are essentially an extension of the legislative branch, which of course is pernicious to the checks and balances that we have in this country, not just from a constitutional perspective, but also thinking about the ethical underpinnings of that. As I was sort of discussing earlier, one key purpose of the courts is to serve as a check on the legislative branches that can serve purely as democracy or as majoritarian democracy. The courts serve as a check from that, protecting constitutional rights. These courts serve a deep ethical purpose, and the sort of political corruption and deterioration of the courts that is both a symptom and a cause, and something that this practice is going to further is something that is deeply ethically troubling.
1 minute.
As a just final point, I want to address sort of a counter that may be raised to the divergence from our framework that we have in the sake of human rights violations, which is I could see an argument that, like you've laid out the importance of not violating federal law, of not legislating for other states. So why can't a state, if it finds a law morally reprehensible, just not enforce that law? We just think that completely undermines, the utility of federal laws in the first place, and just sort of like fundamentally changes the balance of power and the ability of, federal bodies to actually enforce human rights legislation. Because, I think we'd all agree that's a big reason why we have a federal government. It's an agreed upon sort of body that sort of protects our human rights and everything. So sort of our divergence from the framework, while it may initially seem to undermine the federal government, is actually meant to overall protect the sanctity of human rights and the protection given by the federal government.
And that is time. Okay, U.S. Naval Academy, you have 1 minute to confer and then up to 5 minutes. Ten seconds. Okay, you have 5 minutes to offer a commentary, and I will give you a verbal warning at 3 minutes remaining and 1 minute remaining. You may begin.
Thank you. And first of all, we'd like to thank Tufts University again for their dialogue on this important consideration in our modern society. And we would like to fundamentally agree with you that our answer is also no, that it is not ethically justifiable for a state government to use the model of a law that it believes is unjust in order to cause this, like you said, legal gamesmanship in the Supreme Court. However, we just have a couple questions about applications of your theory and some of your caveats that you drew. And just to get into one of them, the caveat you drew for major human rights violations, and the example you gave was slavery. And I would just like to ask about what the perception of that and who's making that decision, because I feel like there's a reasonable chance if you asked Gavin Newsom what he believed Senate Bill 8 represented in Texas, he could probably say it's a human rights violation. And the argument about autonomy, especially when regarding slavery, but as well as abortion, is a very prescient argument, especially in the debate over abortion in society. And so who's perceiving and who's arbitrating those major human rights violations when there are differences in state applications?
Thanks, Jackson. I want to ask another question about your slavery example. So you're saying that in the case of this major human rights violation, slavery, if one state views another state's allowance of slavery as morally unjust, that they can then enslave a person so that the Supreme Court will knock down that law. I just want to ask if that is the position you're taking, because that's the position that I sort of took you to be saying. Furthermore, you talked a lot about government by the consent of the governed, and that states have an obligation to create just laws, and that unjust laws violate the will of the people. But what if the will of the people is inherently unjust? Let me give you an example. What if a state puts up a proposition that would ban interracial and same-sex marriage, and the people of the state vote that into law? Should then this principle of democracy outweigh the principle of justice for the members of the state that are in same-sex relationships or in interracial relationships? Furthermore, you talked a lot about
3 minutes.
Again, the government as a result of the governed, but what if this law does not pertain to citizens of this state in question? What if the unjust law in question is not talking about the citizens of the state's own state, and the fact that this state would not be using its own citizens as a mere means, but instead maybe is imposing a tax on citizens of another state, if Texas imposed a tax on citizens of California to try and move there, for example?
Additionally, we'd like you to touch on the point of judicial activism. So you're saying that it's not ethical to use someone as a mere means, but judicial activism oftentimes can do things in one specific instance to make a larger point in society. And do you see this as something that can ever be ethical under your framework?
And just to hit on another point about your assertion that states must respect the democracies of other states, and in order to preserving the sovereignty of individual states in their relationship with the federal government, I would just like to ask if you believe that there might be paternalism concerns about states assuming where to set the bounds with what their own people want in order to serve this interest of respecting other states' democracies. Where can states be justified in nullifying the will of their own people in order to respect the will of people who didn't even vote for them?
Yeah, we do have a question specifically about, is there an ethical system or an ethically justifiable way for a state to dissent from the federal adjudication, from either the federal legislation or from SCOTUS, and what would that look like?
We also wanted to ask on in tie with the will of the people, what if it's the general will of the people in that state for their state to employ these trickery in the Supreme Court justice laws to make sure that this law in the other state is not abided by? And we also were wondering what your response would be for the consequentialist consideration. What if the unjust law that is mirrored in another state will not have any effect, but instead by striking down those laws, there'll be a greater good effect in striking it down in another state?
I also want to bring the point of disenfranchisement, and I asked the question, what happens when a state that is being governed by its people has a large population of disenfranchised people, and then perhaps the will of the people as reflected in their votes isn't actually the will of the people as reflected in its demographics?
And just to put a final consideration, I want to ask if these laws are always being considered, two competing states' interests are always being considered on a moral equivalency. Is Senate Bill 8 in Texas the moral equivalent of the California gun law simply because they're trying to use the same mechanism? And that really also hits on Washington's consequentialist point. Are there not consequentialist concerns about laws that, while they may use the same mechanism and may try to reach at the same legal question, have very different consequences? And we believe that especially ties into the abortion law versus the gun law and the consequences they have on real human beings. And with that, we'd like to thank you once again and cede the rest of our time.
Okay, thank you. Tufts University, you've got 1 minute to confer and then up to 5 minutes to offer a response to that commentary. Fifteen seconds. Okay. You have 5 minutes. I'll give you a verbal warning at 3 minutes and 1 minute remaining. You may begin.
Okay. Thank you so much, the United States Naval Academy, for your thoughtful questioning. I'm going to start kind of from later in the questioning with the question that you brought up about, can a state, in order to petition against, you asked if our human rights sort of caveat meant that, can a state enslave a person for the sake of, protesting a larger law or a law in another state. And I think what you actually brought out is the fact that, as we talked about at the beginning, this is a big question and it's hard to interpret. I think there might be two interpretations of this question. So first I'll lay out the way I think that we were interpreting it, and then I'll lay out the alternative. So the way I was interpreting this question, which might be totally wrong, was if there is an unjust federal law, is it okay for a state to sort of propose their own law in contrast with that? But I think the other interpretation that you were responding to is if there's an unjust law in a state, can another state sort of put forth another unjust law as a way of saying, hey, look, there's unjust laws, Supreme Court, can you come take care of these? So with our initial response, we were basically saying if there's an unjust federal law, that's creating slavery, then it's unjust for the state, even if this is the law, to, go along with that and enforce slavery. So we were saying they should propose a law outlawing slavery despite the federal standard. But under your sort of framework of, if there's an unjust law in one state, is it okay for another state to sort of put forth their own unjust law for the sake of protesting against that state's law and raising it to the attention of the Supreme Court? We say no, because that's using people as a means to an end. We're not going to enslave somebody to protest the moral badness of slavery. With that, I'll hand it off to my colleague, David.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. We recognize that we're talking about state cases of the state changing the law, or a state being implemented in another state imposing a law of a similar model. And in fact, we think that the very nature of the question in the example I've laid out in the case sort of helps us deal with this issue of the slavery question, because in California, they were proposing a law of a similar unjust structure, but it was applied to guns as opposed to applied to abortions. So the solution for slavery would not be to replicate the same law precisely to enslave someone. It would be to make a law that is still unjust, but is of a different nature, with the intent of eventually overturning laws related to slavery. So anyway, with regard to the question of why can't the will of the people sort of override, or why is it that the state's commitment to not violating the democracies of other states, why does that override the will of the people? Like, if people really want to do this, why can't they do it? Again, I think we appeal back to the sort of ethical imperative we see under a federalist structure for states to respect the democracies that they have with one another. In the United States, we have a constitution that, again,
2 minutes left, 2 minutes.
That, again, is a legal framework, but we see an ethical imperative to the idea that states, if they're going to coexist as a country, need to have certain limitations on their behavior. And we view the interference in each other's democracies as something that's necessary for the cohesion of the country. I also want to emphasize that from a consequentialist perspective, Supreme Court rulings are very fragile. I mean, we're seeing that playing out these days with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Regardless of our position on abortion, we're recognizing that these things can come and go with time depending on the makeup of the court, which, given the sort of already sort of anti-democratic nature of the Senate, and which then confirms the appointees, is already sort of a very minorly democratic institution. And so we see this sort of legal gamesmanship as incredibly myopic. The real things that states need to be doing in order to change these unjust laws in other states and across the country is to create the sort of change in public consciousness that will lead to the change that eventually need to be made. So we're skeptical of relying on the courts as a means of, purely a means of social progress simply from this consequentialist perspective. And I'll pass it to Ezra.
Just to quickly touch on the point about how can a state ethically dissent, specifically with regard to legal action, we understand that one, legal action can be brought with an entity that is not necessarily a distinct person, so it can be on behalf of a corporation or something else, and in that case, that would be a different standard in terms of using them as a means. But also, we could have some kind of informed consent in terms of the person who's being represented consenting to be used as a means to an end, specifically on their own behalf for the sake of bettering of the nation. So that could be two answers to how to ethically reform the legal system.
But just to be clear, we're still not at all endorsing, somebody consenting to be enslaved, just, for the sake of advocacy. Like, that's where the human rights sort of stipulation comes in, where we're saying, there is an absolute, there is no circumstance under which we can justify this for some larger end.
And that's time. You can finish your sentence.
That's okay. That's pretty much the gist of it.
All right. Thank you. Judges, you have a minute to confer about questions you want to ask, and then we'll start the Q&A. About 10 more seconds. Okay. And as a reminder, I will also give a 5-minute warning. And the 10-minute Q&A begins now.
Oliver Wendell Holmes was a critic of Immanuel Kant. That came to my mind because you were using the Kantian idea and we're talking about the law. And the thing that Holmes points out is that the law does that all the time. His example was conscription. We send them to the front, and if they're not willing to go, we put a bayonet in their back. But we also are using people as means to an end with the law when we have an end of security or order or legal certainty. And I'm supposing that you think that those things are good things, and laws that achieve those things are very good things. And yet, you see, the problem is that that is using the people as a means to an end. So I'm puzzled about how far you want to go with that.
There it goes. I think just to start off, I think that our particular concern in this case is the use of people as a means to an end that is not rooted in the well-being of the society in that state. In these cases, like conscription or other security-based laws, the overall aim is the overall welfare of the state and abiding by the democratic will of the people. In the case of this legal gamesmanship, they're proposing an unjust law that is actually imposing an unjust end on the people of the state and using them as a means towards that. So I think our concern in this case is with the end itself being an unjust end.
We would also like to recognize that ends like safety in and of themselves are in many ways ends of people. So safety is to protect people. So while there might be an intermediate end of safety, the ultimate end is still the people and their own protection, treating them as an end, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm going to pass to my colleagues.
Okay. If we have time at the end, I'll try to clarify.
Yeah, I could. Happened again, sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, but I guess I just wanted to add as well, this is also in sort of a sense in legislation treating people as a means to an end instead of the law. Like this is a state, when they engage in this gamesmanship, they are using the people as a means to an end that, again, is not rooted in their well-being, like a law, like the law is when it's done in a democratic sense. This is specifically legislating people to, again, a means to an end that is disconnected from their well-being. I don't know if this clarifies further, but.
I think that both Texas and California would disagree with that. In the one case, Texas, they're talking about abortion. In California, they're talking about guns. And we have shootings, mass shootings, more frequently than is, well, it's a very bad thing. So I think they would say, we're doing something that we see as just in both cases.
I think that I totally understand your point that both of these laws sort of can have positive impacts, both SB 8 and the law modeled after SB 8. They can have sort of positive impacts on the society, in terms of safety, in terms of, but when we're thinking about why these laws are created and sort of what this question gets at, is it okay to create these laws for the purpose of advocacy at the Supreme Court level and for the purpose of, using people kind of as a political tool? So what our framework sort of focuses on is like, sure, if Texas wants to pass a law sort of, talking about gun control and almost doing exactly the same thing that they ended up doing in this case, that's fine. But to do it in a political tool as a response to California, ultimately, like, there is no way around the fact that they are fundamentally treating people as a means to an end in a way that we're just not okay with. So we're totally okay with what these laws do and the state's right to do that as long as, it falls in line with federal law. What we're not okay with is doing it, to treat people as a political tool.
And I'll just add, in the case of California and Texas, the intent was to ultimately get these laws, or the intent of California in replicating the Texas law was to eventually get the law overturned at the Supreme Court so that then the Texas law would also be nullified. So their real end wasn't addressing gun control. It was to eventually, again, deal with or interfere with the democracy of the other state. If they were if they were interested in protecting gun control and that was their real end, they wouldn't have been, formulating a law that they were trying to get overturned at the Supreme Court level. So the end in this case is still to change the law of another state, knowing that this gun control law isn't going to be around for very long if they go what they ultimately want.
And then we're at 5 minutes.
So we sometimes talk about democracy as a process, and we sometimes talk about democracy as a value. And you've talked about democracy quite a lot as a process in limiting and thinking about how it is that states create legislation which represent the will of their people. But I want to draw your attention to other sorts of legal issues, and in particular, I'm thinking about federal distinctions with treatment of marijuana versus its treatment in a number of states. So what best represents the will of the people
In the context particularly of the marijuana laws?
in the marijuana law case?
Yeah, I mean, we, in the case, because the states aren't trying to challenge the federal law, like we view this sort of state by state legalization of marijuana as acceptable, given that again, it's not falling into this context of them engaging in this legal gamesmanship, and so we think obviously it'll be depending on it'll inevitably be a case by case basis, but I think in the case of controlled substances, particularly controlled substances that, as we're seeing, are not quite as pernicious as, for example, heroin or these other drugs, and evidence coming out that marijuana is similarly as dangerous is more comparable to smoking tobacco than these harder drugs. We think that in these cases, it's going to be often a case by case basis, but in this case where there's this live issue and this live debate over the acceptability of these, we think that it is reasonable for states to be, if the will of their people wills it, to be legalizing these substances, as long as there is this very live issue and live debate going on. Just generally the principle of states as laboratories of democracy.
3 minutes.
That can create policies that will then be implemented. That's sort of that policy innovation that is able to happen at the state level. So we regard that as morally permissible.
Okay. I want to jump in so we can get to the last question. I want to talk about a habit you settled into, which is referring to unjust laws and immoral laws interchangeably. So here's the tough question. Is the purpose of laws to track our moral judgments?
In general, we think that yes, that law should reflect the democratic will of the people to create the society that they want to live in, and so yes, we do believe that laws should be downstream of morality, because people in a true democracy will be able to make the decisions that the way society should be set up based on their personal moral values.
So just real quick follow-up, does that mean the moral judgments of 51% of the population? Is it like a simple majoritarian ideal?
No, again, I mean, as we discussed, we recognize the importance of checks and balances on majoritarian systems. Again, the courts are an important case of that, that many legislative bodies are majoritarian, and so the courts in constitutions as well can serve as a check against the sort of whims that may come and go in the populace in enacting certain majoritarian properties. So we believe that on these deeper issues of rights, that's where we see the higher, for example, the higher threshold for constitutional amendments. We believe that there are these cases which the minorities need to be protected, and we think that we have systems in the United States to deal with that in many ways. Thank you.
Just over a minute left, if anyone has a quick follow-up question to anything.
Well, I want to go back to your response
1 minute.
you gave to Alex, which is why not think then that for the marijuana case or the instance of these other issues, that we should not think that the will of the people is best reflected by majoritarian views, and why not make a judgment that democracy and the value of democracy is not purely proceduralist?
You've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, we see the will of the people, and that it being not necessarily equivalent to majoritarianism. And so we believe that, yes, that the will of the people is going to carry along the views of the minorities, and we think that that's borne out in the sort of legal infrastructures that we have. So yes, we do sort of reject the majoritarianist ideal of democracy and recognize that the will of the people means much more than simply majoritarianism.
And that is time. Congratulations to both teams. Give them a round of applause. Okay, we'll give the judges a few minutes to total up their scores. One nice thing about cell phones is you guys can just chat by texting each other. It's quieter. Okay. You never know if coaches will get a round of applause after the results. So judges. So why don't you give the judges a round of applause now? And I just want to commend the teams real quickly. I thought some really thoughtfully engaged with each other, and it really did seem to embody the spirit of a collegial discussion for the final round. So it was nice to see. So nice job, both teams. Okay, we're going to have our judges announce the score. We're going to start with Alex Richardson, your judge number one.
Like number one everywhere?
In my heart. Yeah.
Such power. So I organize ethics bowls for a living. I teach other people to organize them. I seldom get to watch them. This was a treat. So thank you. Congratulations to both of you. By a very narrow margin, 53 to 51, I have the U.S. Naval Academy.
It was a treat. Thank you. Also a narrow margin for me. 49 for the Naval Academy, 47 for Tufts.
So I wish I could give spirit points for this award because I want to echo what John said. You two teams embodied exactly what the Laydenson Award is all about and the reason why this competition exists, which is to have this level of really complex, very thoughtful approaches to complex issues in our world that we don't really see in much of politics and the regular conversations in life. So thank you to both of you. So with that said, I have a score of 53 to the U.S. Naval Academy and 51 to Tufts. So congratulations.
Congratulations. Don't go away. We're going to award officially the runner-up and the champion trophies. Okay, join me in congratulating Tufts University, our runner-up for the 2023 APPE IAB. Now, you'll notice that there are 2 trophies left on the table. One of these is the Rutland Cup. It's the big one right in the middle there. Your name will be engraved as the winner of the 2023 APPE IAB Championship, and the cup will be yours for the following year. Please join me in congratulating the United States Naval Academy, this year's champion. I don't want to break it. If you want to join us, there's a sort of a meet and greet. We'll be out in the lobby area. I think there's some popcorn that will be out there, and happy to talk with all of you. Good job, everybody.